Hello everybody, welcome to GM's Corner. Today we'll be doing an episode on the role of a GM in a tabletop group. And I think me and good old Tarippa, good old Bajan here have some differing opinions on that, so it might be interesting to hear that. So I guess just opening straight away, and I'm gonna throw this over to your corner first, Tarippa. What do you think the role of a GM at a table is?
Well, having GM'd many different styles and having played under so many different GMs, like I've experienced a lot of different ways that a GM can take a role in a story. However, I'm myself, the method that I prefer is the one where the GM has the GM's only role in the story is as a catalyst. As a catalyst and as an entity to keep the story moving along. Because I'm of the mind, this is simply the way I DM, that the story should be entirely developed and entirely in the hands of the players and the actions that they take through their characters. That's my view.
Okay. I think the GM's role is basically the same as a wall in squash. So the GM let's say this is one of those fancy walls in squash that has the thing that fires the ball first towards the racket. So the GM sends out an idea, then the players hit it back with either a question or another idea, and then the GM responds to that. So the GM's role is basically to act as this sort of rebounding board in my eyes, where you offer the premise. Then the players basically say, I want to know more about the premise, or this is what I do with the premise. So you're in a dark room, you're tied to a chair. The player either asks, like, how tightly are my wrists bound, are my feet bound? Or they say, I'm going to try and break the restraints. And then you, as the GM, interpret that how you want. And if they say break the restraints, say, are you using a dagger? Are you just trying to break it with strength? And then sort of adopt that. And that's where the system comes in to sort of supply the GM with structure for that half of the whole sort of communication thing. So that's the role of a GM for me, is basically to act as, because it really is an odd concept for me when GMs start getting into that whole like GM player characters. And I know the reason a lot of people get sort of annoyed with GM player characters is because the GM could give themselves better loot, better things like that. My issue is that it sort of oversteps the bounds of, I personally find it really hard if I know what a monster's abilities or stats are. I find it really hard in character as a player to not in any way try and use those. So if I know, oh, these guys are love fine art, then in negotiations I'll try and bring fine art up. If I'll try and think of a way that my character would know that or try and even like consider that. So I think as a GM, there's always like that subconscious thing of like, I know the solution to this problem, so either you have to keep your mouth entirely shut and not contribute, in which case, what's the point? Or you have to contribute, and then the other players either are going to take that as gospel, or you're just going to solve the problem because you know the solution.
Right. You brought a couple interesting points, actually. I'm very much in agreement that DM PCs, sorry, are like, those are the antithesis to the way I DM. Like I like to DM with a very hands-off approach where the world is both living but also reactive. So I try to make the world seem like a living thing where the players go from place to place. Something's always happening. Like, no one just walks into a town and everyone there is just waiting to serve you. No, like there might be a cult.
You don't just walk in there and there's like a message board with all the quests on that haven't been taken up, and none of them are in progress. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's not the only thing towns are for. Towns are living things. Any settlement is a living thing. So that is definitely a big tenet of how I run basically the world. And then there is also the idea that the world should be reactive, in my case at least, in that the players do something, I do something back, cause and effect. And I think that's necessary for any realistic game world someone's trying to run. Players commit a crime, there is some response, some judicial response, governmental, what have you. But it doesn't have to be committing a crime. It can simply be the players help a random man, and it just so happens that that man is a former member of the Thieves Guild or something, and then players find themselves in good standing with the Thieves Guild, etc. So I think cause and effect and making the world seem living, it just does away with any kind of need for DMPCs or any kind of hand-holding on the DM's part. As long as you have players that are autonomous, that know how to act on their own volition, then you don't need that chaperone, as I kind of think of them, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you think because this is an interesting concept, because I think I struggle a little bit with this. If you have players that aren't what I call active players, you don't have players who are like, I want to find this sword, I want to improve my armor, I want to find my family. You have players who are like, I want to go along for the ride, and sometimes that's the majority of the party, right? And sometimes that's all of the party. I've had games where none of the players want to do anything active, so I sort of... Where do you think the line between just railroading that party and sort of like actually moving the plot forwards is in that scenario? Because this is something I don't have an answer to, so I was wondering if you could
well,
offer some of the Tarippa insight.
In Tarippa insight. Well, it's funny you asked that, because I'm sure that the D&D game in which you were a player in, that I DM'd for a few months, probably came to mind while you were describing that scenario to me, as you were, for the longest time, the only really driven character in the party, and the only one that had their own goals. And that was kind of what I strived to create the game for, funnily enough. And I found that the players just were not interested in that. They were interested in grabbing onto any hook they possibly could and just letting it take them wherever it may. So to actually answer your question, the line becomes very apparent between simply railroading and finding a way to make the players feel like they have agency when in reality they don't want it. Mm-hmm. It becomes very apparent to both you and the players if you make it apparent. But if, and this is my take, if you have this realistic, living, breathing world that is reactive, that doesn't live for the players, but the players live in the world, then you can deal with a party of only passive players. You can give them a ton of stuff that they'll just latch onto. And if you are the kind of DM who, I'm not talking to you specifically, but anyone really, if you are the kind of DM who prefers an overarching, massive, epic storyline that you do not want your players to diverge from, what I'm suggesting might not be the best way to do it, basically, because what I'm suggesting is simply creating a sandbox, so a world for your players to play in. And ultimately, what that means is knowing your players, basically, to sum up everything I've said in a sentence. Know your players, know the players who you're GMing the game for, and don't cater the game to them, but make the game an experience that will be enjoyable for you and them. Mm-hmm. I think that's a fantastic takeaway. As long as the game experience is enjoyable for you, you're going to enjoy running it. If the experience is enjoyable for them, you're going to have nothing to worry about.
Yeah. Interesting tangent from what you were saying there about the overarching narrative thing, which I find quite interesting, is I think you can have an overarching narrative in a sandbox, but you have to have it on a scale where it will affect almost like every facet of culture. So have like, if it's, and that will have to happen later on. If the players are ignoring that, then that comes as a surprise. That has shock value. That's interesting. So if the players, let's use a great show called Critical Role. If any of you guys haven't seen it, that's an amazing show. But there is a point in the show where Matthew Mercer has basically 3 dragons come down and basically just destroy the player's hometown and start like making a conquest to take over the world. That is something that every person in the world is invested in, because these dragons want to either enslave or kill every like lesser sort of humanoid race. So that is something that every character is invested in. But at the same time, if the players had followed like little hints that were dropped earlier on, they would have discovered more about it. There was more intrigue, but it would have taken away from the shock value. So it's a give and take. I think in an overarching, if you want an overarching narrative, you can do that. You just have to drop hints. Hopefully the players will pick them up. If they don't, then you have the shock value of just dropping a big event on them. And they're like, what? How did this happen? And then like some of them start thinking of how did it happen and start thinking on the foreshadowing or whatever you've placed. And obviously that is catered towards more of a prep GM style than an improv one, which is something we'll talk about probably in a future episode.
Yeah.
But do you have anything to bounce off that?
Yeah, just a little bit. I like that perspective actually, because I have had this perspective that if you're going to run a sandbox world, it's very difficult to have an overarching sort of main storyline. And I've been trying to break that perspective through actually the one in-person game that I run these days, and it's been working. So it's really interesting in that respect, and it's good that you mentioned the sort of shock value aspect that can come about as a result of the party not really caring for the longest time. So I think that's something that a lot of GMs would do well to value. Is first of all, is to not devalue themselves for the fact that their players are not taking an interest in their main storyline. That doesn't mean it's boring. That just means your players are really invested in their characters and their characters' goals. And that once it gets to the point, they will become interested in the story because it will threaten their goals.
Yes.
So, yeah, I'd say keep that in mind. But yeah, I like everything you brought up.
Okay, cool. So another topic that I wanted to sort of approach in this video is how do you think the role of a GM differs from game to game? Because obviously it does. There are games like D&D where your role is very set. You are the GM, you do this. Whereas there are games more like Fate or Apocalypse World, Dungeon World, those sorts of games where it's more muddied, where it's like, hey, I'm the GM, I get final say, but here is something you can do to influence the narrative. So in Dungeon World, you can have players, create things about the world. You can have them create things about the scene. In Fate, you can spend fate points to try and compel even other people's characters to do things, which is usually a GM-only thing. It's like, hey, I will give you this fate point if you go eat that guy. If you're like a cannibal and have urges to eat people, then in the middle of like a formal dinner, you can try and convince someone to eat people. So it's just more interesting. I think the sort of we're getting into an interesting place in role-playing games where the GM doesn't have to just be the GM. They can offset some of that responsibility, some of those resources to players, which I think is really cool. So I was just wondering on sort of your thoughts on that, and if you had any interesting systems that you know of that approach GMing in an interesting or fun way.
So I certainly have an answer to it, but I want to kind of preface what I'm about to say with something regarding the idea that there are many different systems with many different ways of GMing. Just to preface that, I think a lot of people kind of overlook when it comes to picking a role-playing game. D&D isn't the only role-playing system, and in fact, it's being outmoded by a lot of other systems for specific jobs. Like Fate does the collaborative storytelling much better than D&D, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And Dungeon World does the simple storytelling much better than D&D. But anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I just wanted to make that clear. Like, D&D isn't the only system you should ever think about running. However, in terms of what other systems kind of make that a gray area, one system came to mind, and this might be a little out of place, but I would highly recommend it to anyone whose group might kind of take your job as a DM or GM for granted. I would play a game called Microscope with them. I think you've heard of it, Whiskey.
Yeah.
If not played it. Yeah. It's a fantastic system. To call it a system is kind of is a little bit demeaning.
It's possibly like more like a tool almost.
Yeah,
a very powerful one, but it's sort of like halfway between a system and a tool. It's a very interesting sort of box.
Yeah, exactly. If you're looking for a way, it serves so many purposes. If you're looking for a way to involve your players in the act of world building for the world they'll be playing in, Microscope. That is the system for you. If you want to show your players kind of what it's like to be a DM while also being amongst them, there is no game master role in Microscope. Generally, you'll want someone who knows the rules a bit better than the next guy, but there's no overarching master of ceremonies.
Yeah.
It is a completely level playing field. You all add equally to the story. And I think, to bring it back, that is kind of the crux of systems that take the GM out of tabletop role-playing games. So that's the extreme end of the spectrum, basically. And then on the other end, if I had to say, like, what system kind of takes... I think it might be D&D. There are a lot of systems like D&D, so I'm not just going to, like, lump D&D in over on the other side of the spectrum where the DM has all the control. But, yeah, you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I think D&D is a good sort of middle of the pack of that sort of game. There are games where it's more extreme, where GMs straight up like have entire control over the narrative, like the players don't get even as much of a say in anything. In D&D, I think you're a lot more allowed to influence the actual narrative and how the campaign's going, whereas in games like Pendragon, it's going in a very specific direction. Yes. And the GM is the GM. The game is the game. The players are playing through that story. Whereas in D&D, you have a bit more free flowingness. But yeah, I think it's a good sort of that and Stars Without Number. The same thing where they have the same setting, but then the GM can go where they want with it. I think D&D and Stars Without Number exist in this very sort of... They are very good examples of the genre of role-playing games that they exist in. But yeah, so sort of like one of the last things I wanted to talk about is what do you think about what are your thoughts on the sort of situations where these areas we've been talking about become grayed, where the GM's role becomes muddied? So this can be, for example, one thing is taking away the player's agency, which is something that is done a fair amount, I think. Done well about 50% of that amount, but basically taking away the player's agency because the GM... This is the issue of egos, because no matter what, if you are taking away a player's agency, it's because the GM thinks that will be better for the story. Whether that is for a cinematic, where they're just like, I want to have the players be really cool here, whether it's for a scene where you're like, I want the players to be arrested without them trying to break out and getting themselves killed. These sorts of things, the GM is thinking, I know better than what you will try and do. So I was, and the other one is GM PCs, but we talked a bit about that earlier, so I think we've got that covered. But yeah, sort of that sort of area where the GM can overstep their bounds, and I think my thoughts on that is that the main solution is communication, making sure your players are okay with things in the game, making sure, for example, that they're okay with characters being killed in very brutal ways, descriptions of that, or if they just prefer to say, sorry, your character failed his last save, they've passed on to the next life. But yeah, I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's very interesting you mentioned that, because, and the 50% thing that you said is very, very accurate, I think, because as a DM, when you're doing that, you're flipping a coin, basically, like, and whether it turns out to be a positive experience for you and your players is dependent on how well you know your players and how well you know their characters, or at least how well you think you know their characters. So if you are doing something that you believe is going to benefit the party and benefit the players' enjoyment of the game, I wouldn't be so sure so quickly, because what you might think the players will enjoy, the players might hate. Like when you try to, actually, I'll give an example. Matthew Colville, a fantastic D&D YouTuber, gives a lot of good DM tips. He had a video recently on cinematics, and within that video, he gave an example of how he told his party that, hey, you guys are in this situation. You're all in chains, manacled up, and there's one mind flayer in the room. And they were taken prisoners by mind flayers time ago.
Right.
I'm going to take control of the situation for about a few seconds, and let stuff play out as it should, basically, without taking roles into account. And I very much respect the risk he took there, because that's indicative of how well he knows his players and how well he knows himself as a DM. Because if that had been my group of players, I would have gotten to the end of my cinematic sequence. 2 players would have been like, damn, that went well. And then a 3rd player would be like, that didn't feel good. I didn't like that. I would have done this differently. I would have done that. So it's a risk you take, which is never, I don't think, ever necessary to run a game, but to run the game you want to run and to run the game that is fun for everyone, it can absolutely be necessary. So those are my thoughts, basically, in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think this one is a difficult one to answer, because the answer is always going to be slightly wish-washy in that it differs. But yeah, I think the main solution is knowing your players, like you said, or if you don't, communicating with them ahead of time. Yeah. So the thing that you said about Matthew Colville is interesting, because it sounds like he both knew his players, but also communicated like, hey, would this be okay? This is what I'm doing. This is okay with you, right? Sort of thing. And that is, I think, the optimum way to solve these sort of situations. Making sure your players are okay with having their agency taken away, making sure they're okay with putting their characters in very uncomfortable situations. Some players are very uncomfortable if their characters are uncomfortable, and that's not sort of an environment you want to breed at the table, is this sort of distrust towards the GM. It's like, what if they put me in that situation again? You don't want that in your game. But yeah, that's a very interesting topic, but also not the best one to end a video on.
It's definitely controversial.
Do you have anything else that you sort of want to get my thoughts on, discuss over, like, what you think the role of a GM is?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, something that I am curious about, having played in several of your games, is how do you take into account a character's backstory when it comes to world building? Because a story is not just the story that the players make with their characters. The story is the world. The story is what is happening all around the players and the characters. And how this is kind of the role of players in world building, but I'm extending it a little bit here. So what would you say would be maybe your personal take, and then what you would recommend to other people, the role of a GM when it comes to extending world building privileges to players, but not overtly, not saying like, what's here, guys? More like, okay, this is in your backstory. All right, that's cool. That's going to be here. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really interesting topic, actually, because there is I'm going to preface before I say anything else that on the player side of this, the rule of don't bite the hands that feed you stands. So if the GM is being nice and saying, here is an opportunity for you to make something, it's like, where is your character from? And you're playing like this tiny, frail, wizardly gnome, and you're just like, I come from the depths of a volcano where I was raised by a dragon, and that's how I got my dragon sorcery. It's like, okay, yeah, but no. Cheers, thank you. You enjoy your snowflake somewhere else. You melt in the volcano. But yeah, like, don't be a dick. Try and be reasonable. When the GM asks that question, feel free to ask questions back. Like, if they ask you, where is your halfling from? What are halflings do in this world? Feel free to ask them back. Like, I would like to be from hills. Would that be a lightfoot or a stout halfling? Like, I would like to sort of live in a hill area as opposed to like a sort of urban area. But yeah, anyway, on to the actual question. I've approached this in a lot of different ways, depending on the campaign. I have run ones where the worlds are created almost entirely by the players, and I fill in the blanks. Where I essentially say, all right, so I'm going to be creating a world. What are all of your characters, and where are they from? We will be starting the game in a week, and then that gives me a week to basically build up the area around them and any sort of key locations, and sort of set the world up from that. So we had my first. This is my approach when I started GMing, and is an approach I like to do, but I haven't really done since. But we had a lot of players who had a lot of demon stuff going on. So I was like, if 4 out of 5 people have some form of association with demons, that means that there's something weird in the world for that high percentage of demon activity to be going on. So I had the lower half of the country, essentially, to have in the last 100 years, very Oblivion-esque, like a portal opened, and demons have been spewing out. And all the countries have had to sort of like bind together, form all of their armies into this one sort of choke point, where they basically just have to constantly be battling demons. But yeah, this whole sort of that whole sort of thing, and there's also the where are you from, what is your culture like, and you can also, without even asking that question, something that I found quite interesting to do is prod it from the game. So in the game, have NPCs put the players in situations, or straight up ask the players questions like. You can have an NPC challenge a character's moral code. And then later on, let's say the player is from an order that the player hasn't told you much about, either because they're being aloof or some other reason. But they're from a paladin or a knight's order or something, and you want to find out more about this order. So you put a NPC in their way, like Ashwell from our LoadingDice series, who basically is like, I will give you a really big reward, but you have to break an oath. And then that person's like, I will never break an oath. My word is my bond, like Gideon did. Out of the game, I will then ask if that person's from like a group. I'm like, is that the whole mentality of your group? Is that one of their teachings? Or is that just like your character thing? So that's a very sort of interesting way to build it. But yeah, so I've approached it that way of just building everything off of the players. I've approached it in one of my other campaigns, one that ended relatively recently, where I did a lot of the world building, but then left open a lot of what the players wanted as a thing. If a player wanted to be a knight of the king, they could be. I would then work on what the knights of the king are, what they mean, based on the world. Obviously, basically in this world, I built the framework. I built all the countries. I knew the country sort of goals. I built some cities that are key, and I built key NPCs. So that the players, when they ask, hey, can I do this? I'm like, oh, I have an idea to like respond to that with. Like, hey, are there any magic colleges? I'm like, yes, there is one right here, which you can be from if you want. It's like this. Or there's another one which is like this, which is like a necromancy college, blah, 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 if you're interested in that. And then rebuild that way. And then the most recent game that I've done on stream is the Essian game, the LoadingDice game, where my intention was, I started it in January, and my intention was to build the entire world for a year or two, and then play in it. But we got very excited about setting up a stream, so instead we preempted that. But as a result, almost the entire starting area that the players were in, and everything around them, I have NPCs for like 20 NPCs per city, 10 NPCs per town. The towns have culture for the last like few hundred years, all that sort of thing. And then it's the players' role for me to say, where do you want to fit in? And there's still flexibility in that. Like, for example, Shan, you made a gnome, and I asked, where do you want your gnomes to be from? Because that's something that I hadn't thought 100% of yet. I knew that they were from this island, majoritively, but I wanted to know where precisely. And Bishan let me know, like, hey, the rock gnomes, majoritively live underground. I am an sort of aberrant in that case because I've left. And then me and him worked on stream during the character creation episode on what that meant, why he was an aberrant, and how his mentality differed from the other gnomes. He asked me like, what is the general sort of ethos of the gnomish mentality, and then he was like, oh, that's really cool. My character will not be like that because my character's rebellious.
Yeah.
But yeah, So I've approached it 3 different ways. I think right now I'm favoring the second one of building the framework and then allowing the players to build on top of that. But I'm also, just because world building is a very fond hobby of mine, I also enjoy building like as much of the world as I can ahead of time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Nice.
What are your thoughts on that? I know I was rambling for quite a while there.
No. I mean, I asked you the question. Yeah, no, my thoughts are pretty simple. I think I share a lot of opinions with you. I think that the players should have some say in the world, but to a point. So, I think as a DM who has not planned their whole world, I would recommend like be willing to bend in some of the agency and aspects of your world, but do not break. So I'll give you an example that's similar to your special snowflake example. No offense, Sin, don't hate me. Basically, had a player. He made a tiefling warlock, and I was like, "This is a cool character. What's his background?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, he comes from an ancient line of da 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 da." Okay, cool. Hey, write me a backstory for him. I always like if people write me a backstory, and he wrote me a backstory. I read it. And he said that he was the one of the last living descendants of the primogenitor of the tieflings, and I was all like, "How about no?" Because like that, I liked everything he had written. I think he's an aspiring fiction author, so it makes sense. I liked everything he had written, but the problem is I had things in my world that negated about half his backstory. So I would say be willing to tell your character, your players, you can't have that. I'm sorry, this is how that works. So if you have a player come to you and be like, yeah, all gnomes get gifted their first set of tinker tools when they're 5 years old, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. They're 5 years old. Wouldn't they like choke on it? And then that's when you tell them, I like your idea. How about we make it 10 years old? That's a compromise between you and your players in that respect.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing that probably throughout this entire series I'm going to be rambling on about. It's all about sort of, like you've been saying, understanding your players, and then if you don't, communicating with them. So chat with them, and the same works for players. And if any of you lovely people are watching this series as well, talk to your GM as well. In that scenario, ask your GM. In the example you were using of your friend playing the tiefling, he could have come to you and say like, hey, is there like an extremely long line of tieflings already in the world? Because I know I have some of those who have like been for hundreds of years and have this sort of whole culture built around their sort of infernal heritage. He could also ask like, are there any devil lords, archdevils who are particularly sort of have a penchant for tieflings, and if so, which one of them is the sort of one of them who is sort of like more jaded or whatever, and ask those sort of questions of your GM while you're writing this to get some stories, because it's all well and good when people want to write like little short stories. That's really cool. I'm really glad that you're that interested in the world, but if you write me a short story where you've made up a town in my world with all of these NPCs and you've said this town is here, I'm like, yeah, that town is entirely run by vampires. That country is overrun with undead. Sorry, doesn't work. You have to be able to ask your GM like, hey, is this a good place? Can I have free reign over this? Essentially, and then if the GM says yes, then you're free to go. But that's what I'd say. So I think with that, I think we will wrap up this episode of the GM's Corner. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope you all have a greater understanding of what the role of a GM is, and if not, and you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below, and we will try and respond to them as best we can, hopefully with less novel-esque answers as we've been giving here. Hopefully we can make things more concise when writing it out. But yeah, thank you all for watching. We'll see you in the next episode, which will be devoted to how to prep your first game.
Oh boy.
Yes. See you in the next one.
Take it easy.
Thank you for coming, Tripper.
Thank you for having me.
Let me know when you're ready.
I'm just trying to, like, fuck with my webcam to see if it'll break.